It began with a whisper, faint, trembling, but unstoppable. In the quiet suburbs just south of Atlanta, a story long buried beneath the melodies of choir hymns and the creak of old pews was clawing its way back into the light. Faith Hill Baptist Church stood at the corner of Magnolia and 3rd, an aging red brick structure with a white wooden steeple that pierced the sky like a question left unanswered. For 63 years, that church harbored a secret so heavy that it bent the lives of everyone who crossed its doors. And in the fall of 2025, a trembling voice would shatter that silence forever. The confession came on a humid Sunday morning. The congregation had gathered as always, neatly dressed, polite, faithful. The smell of old hymnals mixed with fresh lilies and the faint sweetness of perfume. Reverend Thomas Calhoun, now 87, walked slowly to the pulpit. His hands shook as they always did these days, but his voice, when it came, was not that of an old man. It was the voice of someone unburdening a soul. "Before I go," he began, the microphone catching the dryness of his breath, "there's something you all need to know about the summer of 1962. A murmur spread through the pews like static. No one moved at first. The pastor's wife, Lillian, sat in the front row, her face turning pale. The choir director, who had been sorting through her sheet music, froze mid-page. Reverend Calhoun's words cut through the still air, steady and deliberate. That summer, someone disappeared. A young woman. Her name was Evelyn Carter. The name sent an almost electric charge through the room. For some of the oldest members, it was a ghost resurfacing. For the younger ones, it was a name they had only ever overheard when older voices dropped to a whisper. Evelyn had been the church's brightest light. 17, soft-spoken and deeply devoted, she came to every service, sang in the choir, and taught the children's Bible class. And then, one August evening, she was gone. No body was found. No one ever charged. The official story called it a runaway. The real story was something else entirely. As Reverend Calhoun paused, pressing a trembling hand to his chest, memories flooded back like the Georgia heat of that long-ago summer. He had been a young preacher then, just 24, newly installed and eager to lead. Faith Hill Baptist was smaller, rougher, its congregation worn by time and labor. Evelyn was one of the first to greet him. He remembered her laughter echoing through the church kitchen as she helped arrange flowers for Sunday service. Her smile was gentle, but guarded, as if she carried the weight of a world that few could see. That year, Atlanta was on edge. Tensions between black and white communities simmered under the surface. Families worried about protests and change, about what might come next. But Faith Hill Baptist tried to stand apart, a sanctuary from the world's noise. By night, however, those same walls shielded whispers of scandal, relationships, betrayal, and, as would later emerge, something much darker. Back in the present, the congregation leaned forward, transfixed. Outside, the church bell tolled faintly, 11 times. Inside, time itself seemed to stop. No one dared breathe too loud. "I wasn't honest," Reverend Calhoun continued. "I told the police what I thought they wanted to hear. But I knew more. I knew what she had told me the night before she went missing." Gasps rippled through the room. That line alone shifted the story from distant tragedy to living confession. Years of Sunday sermons about truth, redemption, and sin suddenly turned inward, aiming squarely at the man speaking them. The pastor stepped back from the pulpit, adjusted his glasses, and looked across the church. Faces that had trusted him, children he had baptized, marriages he had blessed, funerals he had preached. He had spent 63 years building a legacy of faith. Now, with one breath, he was dismantling it. "I was young," he said softly, "and I failed her." The story that followed unfolded like a wound reopening. Evelyn Carter had come to the parsonage one evening, late. The July sky was bleeding orange into purple, cicadas humming through the heat. She stood on his porch, holding her Sunday hat nervously, her white gloves soiled from the dusty road. She had been crying. Evelyn confided something to him that night, something she swore he must never repeat. She was pregnant, and the father was a married man from the congregation. Reverend Calhoun admitted that he was stunned. The church prided itself on decency. To shield reputations back then mattered more than saving souls. He told her to pray, to stay silent, to let God provide the answer. But Evelyn, strong-willed beneath her gentle appearance, refused to be hidden away. She wanted to confront the man. She wanted justice, or at least acknowledgement. That man, as Reverend Calhoun now confessed, was none other than one of the church's deacons, Harold Peterson, a respected businessman and one of the church's biggest owners. The revelation sent murmurs collapsing into full-blown uproar. Some cried. Some prayed aloud. Reverend Calhoun's voice began to waver, but his memory pushed on. He said that he had tried to dissuade Evelyn, begged her to reconsider, told her the damage it would cause, to Harold's family, to the church, to God's house. But Evelyn was resolute. She left the parsonage that night, walking straight toward the church. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. When her disappearance hit the following morning, the entire community searched. Dogs, volunteers, flashlights in the woods. The police questioned everyone, including the pastor. Harold Peterson denied any affair. Reverend Calhoun said nothing. Days turned into weeks, the story faded, and by autumn, life pushed forward. Officially, Evelyn Carter had run away. Unofficially, her name vanished from Sunday mentions. Harold moved to Macon. Reverend Calhoun stayed, and carried that silence through 6 decades of sermons. Now in front of everyone, he closed his eyes and whispered, "I lied to you all, and to God." I knew Harold returned that night. I saw his truck outside the church. He paused, and I heard them arguing inside. The sanctuary erupted with whispers and sobs. The weight of 63 years' worth of lies pressed down like the Georgia heat. The truth, long buried beneath faith and formality, was finally clawing its way out. Reverend Calhoun stepped back from the pulpit, tears streaming freely. "I can't undo what I did," he said. "But before the Lord takes me, you deserve to know there was blood on the church floor that night, and I cleaned it." The room fell utterly silent. The organist lowered her hands. A child started crying in the back pew. And then, just as the pastor's voice faltered, a sound rose from the far end of the sanctuary. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The church doors creaked open, letting in the late morning sunlight. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was a man none of them recognized, a man who claimed he was Evelyn Carter's nephew. He stood framed by the doorway, sunlight spilling around him like a halo carved from fire. Every pair of eyes in Faith Hill Baptist turned toward him, toward this stranger whose presence felt heavy with purpose. The church, frozen mid-breath, waited. The only sounds were the ticking of the ceiling fan and the pastor's labored breathing behind the pulpit. The man's silhouette was tall and lean, his hat clutched in one hand, his expression unreadable. He walked forward slowly, each footstep echoing against the wooden floorboards with deliberate weight. When he reached the center aisle, he stopped, looked straight at Reverend Calhoun, and said, "My name's Marcus Carter. Evelyn was my aunt." It was as if the air itself changed. Conversations died. The choir members froze. The older women in the second pew stared at him with something close to fear. The name Evelyn Carter hadn't been spoken aloud in that building for more than 60 years, not in prayer, not in memory. It existed only in silence. Reverend Calhoun's hand gripped the pulpit. "You're your aunt?" he stammered. "That can't be. Evelyn had no children." "That's right," Marcus replied. His voice was calm, but beneath that calm was fire. "But she had a brother, my father. He spent his life searching for her, asking questions no one would answer. He died never knowing what happened. But I intend to find out." The pastor's wife, Lillian, pressed a hand against her chest. The congregation exchanged tense glances. Whispers stirred again like restless wind, but Marcus spoke over them, louder now. "I've read the reports," he said. "I've walked this church's grounds. And now I know she never left Atlanta. She never left this place." The pastor's shoulders sagged. His eyes flicked toward the altar, then the floor, before returning to Marcus. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice thin with exhaustion. "The truth," Marcus said. The single word hung in the air like a verdict. Reverend Calhoun seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of 60 years had finally settled upon him. "I already confessed," he murmured. "No," Marcus cut in. "You confessed to knowing something. Now I want to know everything." Every member of the congregation leaned in as the old pastor's voice, trembling and dry, began to unspool the memories he had fought to bury. "She came to me that night," he said, "the night before she disappeared. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock. The cicadas were screaming outside. She stood on my porch wearing her Sunday dress, holding her hat in her hands. I remember her eyes, red from crying." He paused, wiping at his forehead despite the chill of the church air. "She told me she was pregnant." A collective murmur rippled through the room. "The father," Calhoun went on, "was a married man from our congregation, Harold Peterson, one of my deacons." Someone gasped. Lillian lowered her gaze. Old men turned red-faced in discomfort. That name, Harold Peterson, had once commanded respect in the city, a man of business and reputation. "She said she couldn't hide it any longer," Calhoun continued, his words slow, each one scraping against the silence. "She wanted him to tell the truth, to face what he'd done. I told her to stay quiet, that exposing him would destroy families, the church, everything we'd built. But she wasn't afraid. She said she would confront him that night." Marcus's stare hardened. "And you let her go?" "I did," Calhoun whispered. "And that choice has haunted me every day of my life." His head bowed as the memory consumed him. The storm outside deepened, thunder rumbling far away, as though the heavens themselves demanded he continue. "I went back to the church later that night," he said. "Something told me she was still here. The hall light was on, the same one that shouldn't have been. I heard voices through the crack in the door. Hers. And his. She was crying. He was begging. I stepped closer, and then his throat tightened. She screamed. The sound of the storm filled the space between his words. When I rushed in, the light was gone. My hands were shaking. I called her name, no answer. I tripped over something. It was her. She was lying near the altar steps, bleeding. Still alive, barely. I called for help, but before anyone came, I saw Harold's truck speed away." Marcus's jaw went tense. "And you protected him." The pastor's voice dropped to a whisper. "I protected the church. That's what I told myself. When the police came, I said she was restless, troubled, that she left days before. They didn't question me. A preacher's word was sacred back then." No one moved. No one breathed. The congregation, the same people who had looked to him for guidance, for clarity, now saw him as something else entirely. A man who had sacrificed truth in the name of reputation. Marcus took a step forward. "Where is she, Reverend?" Calhoun hesitated, his eyes glassy. He looked toward the floor. "Before Harold left town, he came to me one last time," he said. "He told me what he'd done. He said no one would ever find her. He hid her body somewhere no one would dare disturb it, beneath God's house." Marcus stared at him, disbelief written all over his face. "Here," he whispered. "You mean she's under this church?" Calhoun nodded. "Under the prayer room, beneath the floorboards. And I've walked over her every Sunday since." A horrified cry broke from the back pew. Others turned away, trembling. Marcus's eyes welled with tears, but his anger kept them from falling. "You preached forgiveness," he said, voice burning. "But you never asked for hers." The old man lifted his eyes, voice weak but steady. "I spoke to her memory in every sermon I gave. I thought that was enough." "It wasn't," Marcus shot back. "This isn't forgiveness. It's rot wearing a halo." The thunder outside cracked closer, booming above the church. The lights flickered. Some in the congregation began to weep openly, while others knelt, praying aloud, asking God to have mercy on them all. Marcus walked toward the altar, each step echoing in heavy rhythm with the thunder. He stopped at the edge of the prayer room door. "I'm going to find her," he said quietly, not looking back. "You can't," Calhoun rasped. "It's been sealed for decades." "I'll unseal it," Marcus replied. "With or without your blessing." The pastor tried to rise, but his legs gave out. Lillian cried out, helping him sit. He looked at Marcus one last time, his eyes weary, hollow, and full of surrender. "When you open that floor," he said, voice trembling, "pray that you're ready for the truth. There's more buried there than bones." Marcus didn't answer. He knelt, pressing his hand against the old floorboards, his palm flat against the wood as the storm raged outside. The faint scent of varnish and dust filled his lungs. Beneath the history, the hymns, the prayers, something waited. And for the first time since 1962, Faith Hill Baptist Church felt alive again, trembling under the weight of what was about to be uncovered. The storm raged through Atlanta, washing the streets clean, while lightning flashed over the faint silhouette of Faith Hill Baptist Church. Inside, the storm had already begun long before the rain touched the steeple. Marcus knelt at the edge of the prayer room. The congregation had mostly emptied out, some too shaken to stay, others too ashamed to watch. Only a handful remained. The deacons, Lillian Calhoun, 2 reporters who had slipped in through the back once word spread, and Reverend Calhoun himself, slumped in the front pew with a blanket around his shoulders. "What are you planning to do?" one of the deacons asked, his voice trembling. "That floor's sacred ground." Marcus set down his jacket, rolling up his sleeves. "Then God can watch what man tried to hide." The pastor's wife covered her face, whispering a prayer through tears. But Marcus didn't stop. He picked up a crowbar from the maintenance closet. The metal felt cold and heavy, yet right in his hands, as if it were the weight of 63 years waiting to be lifted. When the first plank cracked, the sound echoed like thunder inside the small room. Sawdust and rot filled the air. Marcus worked methodically, breath ragged, sweat glistening under the fluorescent lights. Piece by piece, the church began to give up its secrets. Each creak of wood seemed to drag up the ghosts of the past, voices that had been silenced by fear and reverence. Calhoun's frail voice carried weakly from the pew. "Stop, please. There's no need. Let the dead rest." Marcus didn't look back. "She's not resting," he said. "She's been trapped here because of your lies." Another plank gave way with a groan. Beneath it, the earth was packed tight and dry, smelling of old clay and decay. Marcus leaned in, brushing away the dust, until his fingers met something hard, smooth, a fragment of bone. The room froze. Someone gasped. Lillian sobbed into her hands. Even the thunder seemed to pause in reverence. Marcus pulled back, his breath sharp in his chest. He looked up at Calhoun, who now sat trembling violently. "She's here," Marcus said quietly. "Exactly where you said." The old pastor nodded weakly, eyes full of tears. "I told him not to," he whispered, voice cracking. "I begged Harold not to hurt her. But when he came to me with his hands bloody, I chose silence." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You chose yourself." He dug a little deeper, his fingers uncovering remnants of torn cloth, faded blue cotton, the color almost gone to gray. Around it, the soil held small traces of what once had been buttons, a rosary, the bent frame of a church name tag, Evelyn C. Marcus sat back on his heels, his hands trembling, his throat closing. She was here all along. The reporters snapped photographs, flashes flickering against the stained glass windows. One of the deacons fell to his knees, muttering a prayer so fast the words blurred together. Lillian turned to her husband. "Tom," she cried softly, "why didn't you tell me?" The Reverend looked up, his face pale with exhaustion. "Because I thought God would forgive what the world couldn't," he said. "But I was wrong. Forgiveness doesn't come from hiding the truth." Police sirens began to wail faintly in the distance. Someone must have called them when the digging began. Marcus sat motionless beside the broken floor, staring at the fragment of bone. The rain outside hit harder, streaming down in sheets against the church's stained glass. When the police arrived, they sealed off the sanctuary and ordered everyone back. Investigators from the Cold Case Division entered quietly, as if respecting the sacred space they were disturbing. One officer, young, cautious, and visibly shaken, knelt beside the opening and shone his flashlight down. Within seconds, he turned to his partner and nodded grimly. "It's a human skeleton," he said. Female, likely buried decades ago. The room exhaled a single, grieving breath. Calhoun covered his face and began to weep, not the contained, quiet tears of sorrow, but the deep, animal kind of crying that shook through his brittle frame. "Lord have mercy," he said again and again. "Lord have mercy." Marcus approached him, his expression unreadable. "You said Harold buried her," he said. "Where is he now?" "Dead," Calhoun whispered. "He died in 1989, throat cancer." His eyes flicked away. "He never repented. I waited. I prayed he would. But he died free while she stayed hidden." The officers continued working, documenting every angle, every artifact. The reality of the scene began to dissolve the reverence that once guarded the church. Faith Hill Baptist was now a crime scene, its pews cordoned off with yellow tape. Marcus stood near the altar, watching as they lifted what was left of his aunt. For a moment, the world blurred. The legacy of rumor, silence, and false peace crumbled before his eyes. "She deserved more than this," he said quietly. One officer approached him. "You her relative?" He nodded. "Then you'll be the one to identify whatever remains," the officer said. "They'll take her for analysis tonight." Marcus nodded again, speechless. As the workers carried the small bundle of bones away, he whispered under his breath, "You're going home, Aunt Evelyn." For the first time, the words didn't echo. It was as if the walls themselves exhaled, loosening a grief that had lingered too long. Reverend Calhoun kept his head bowed. "When she left that night," he said shakily, "she told me I didn't understand what sin really meant. I thought she was angry. But she was right. Sin isn't what we confess on Sunday. It's what we bury to keep our image clean." Marcus turned to him. The anger in his eyes had softened, tempered by pity. "Then you have one last chance to make it right," he said. "How?" "Tell the world everything you did. Tell them her name. Tell them the truth." Calhoun nodded slowly. "I will," he said, "before God calls me home." Outside, dawn began breaking through the rain. The clouds thinned, turning gray into gold. The city below awoke to headlines that would shake it. Atlanta church murder reopened after 63 years. Remains found under altar. Inside Faith Hill Baptist, only Marcus and the pastor's wife remained. The sanctuary smelled of rain and earth. In that fragile quiet, Lillian spoke softly to Marcus. "You've set her free," she said. He looked toward the altar once more, now scarred by the torn floor, and whispered, "No, ma'am. She set herself free the night she refused to stay silent." The storm outside faded, leaving only the soft hum of morning traffic and the faint cry of doves perched on the church roof, as though, after 63 years, the city itself could finally breathe again. By the next morning, Faith Hill Baptist stood draped in yellow police tape, its front steps glistening with rain. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing as uniformed officers carried boxes and evidence bags down the narrow path leading to the church entrance. The sign out front still read Sunday service, 11 a.m., but the building no longer felt like a house of worship. It felt like a confession written in brick and blood. Inside, Marcus sat alone in the front pew, staring at the gaping hole in the floor near the altar. The boards had been pried up, numbered, and photographed. The smell of damp wood and soil lingered in the air. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, splitting into fractured colors that danced across the polished pews, though there was no peace in that light. Detective Ellen Braxton, a 56-year-old veteran of Atlanta's cold case unit, entered silently and stood near the crime scene. She watched Marcus for a moment before approaching. "You're Evelyn Carter's nephew," she said, her tone measured but gentle. Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I never met her, but I've known her story my whole life." Ellen folded her arms. "Your aunt's name was tucked away in an unsolved file for over 6 decades. The case had no body, no confession, no motive that held. Until now." She glanced toward the pulpit, where Reverend Calhoun's Bible still lay open. "He spoke to the press last night. His statement confirmed most of what we suspected." "Did he tell you who killed her?" Marcus asked. Ellen paused. "He named the deacon, Harold Peterson. But Peterson's been dead for a long time. Still, the Reverend will face questioning for destroying evidence and obstructing justice, even if it was 63 years ago. Marcus looked down at his hands. He's an old man. Justice came too late. Ellen leaned against the pew. Sometimes late justice is the only kind left. It's the truth that matters now. From the back of the church, Lillian Calhoun entered quietly. She carried a shawl over her shoulders, eyes red from crying. She offered Marcus a weak smile before approaching Ellen. "He's not eating," she said softly, glancing toward her husband who sat under police supervision in his office. "He just keeps saying her name." Ellen's tone softened. "He'll be taken in soon, Mrs. Calhoun. We'll treat him with respect, but his statement is part of the record now." As the detective stepped outside, Marcus looked again toward the hole in the floor. He thought of the generations who had prayed here, unaware that their voices rose above a lie. He wondered how many times Reverend Calhoun had looked down at that spot, his sermons heavy with guilt. Lillian sat beside him. Her voice trembled. "He wasn't always a coward," she said. "Back then, he was young, afraid of what people would say if they knew a girl like Evelyn had been betrayed by one of their own. He thought burying it would spare us all." "It only buried her," Marcus replied. They sat in silence for a long while, the rain easing outside into soft drizzle. The sound of reporters faded as police vehicles departed one by one. For the first time in hours, the church felt calm, wounded, but breathing again. Later that afternoon, a news crew interviewed Marcus on the steps. The reporter asked, "Do you believe Evelyn Carter finally got justice?" Marcus hesitated. The cameras focused on his face, capturing every flicker of the emotion he had fought to control since yesterday. "Justice isn't a headline," he said. "It's something people carry. My aunt carried it in her heart until someone took it from her. Reverend Calhoun carried its absence until it destroyed him. And now, maybe we can carry what's left." The statement aired that evening across Georgia. By dawn, the story spread nationwide, 63 years silent. Atlanta church murder unearthed by family member. Faith Hill Baptist became both a memorial and a cautionary tale. That same morning, Reverend Calhoun stood before detectives for his final statement. His hands trembled as he signed the last page. "I did what I thought would protect my church," he said, voice wavering. "But in saving its name, I damned its soul." When they let him out the back door, news crews mobbed the exit. Lillian shielded her husband from the flashes, guiding him gently toward the waiting car. He paused before stepping inside and looked toward the church once more, his life's work and greatest sin, standing proud and broken behind caution tape. "I buried the truth here," he said quietly, "but the truth never stays buried for long." That night, Marcus visited the site again. The doors were locked, the sanctuary empty except for the faint smell of rain and dust. He sat near the altar, candles flickering weakly in the draft. He thought about what his father had told him years ago, about how Evelyn had been fearless. She wasn't running, his father had said once. She was standing still, and everyone else ran from her. Now Marcus understood. He ran his fingers over the cracked wooden altar, tracing its grooves, as if they were her fingerprints. "You can rest now," he whispered. "They finally said your name out loud." In the quiet that followed, he thought he could almost hear a faint hum, the echo of a choir practicing in the distance, faint but steady, winding through the church halls like a memory returning home. It wasn't haunting, it was release. Outside, the city lights shimmered against wet pavement. For the first time in 63 years, Faith Hill Baptist stood in peace, not because it was purified, but because the truth had finally stepped through its doors. The past was no longer buried beneath the altar, and the people left behind could finally decide what to build in its place. Justice had come slowly, imperfectly, painfully. Yet in that imperfect truth, Evelyn Carter's name was alive again, not in whispers or rumors, but in the open air of a city ready to remember. The courthouse in downtown Atlanta was crowded on the morning Reverend Thomas Calhoun was brought in. Reporters lined the marble steps, their microphones waiting to capture a story 6 decades in the making. The air hummed with tension, not a scandal, but a reckoning. Inside, The pews of the courtroom filled with citizens too curious to stay away from a case that had shaken their city's faith to its core. Marcus sat in the second row. His expression, steady though exhaustion, traced deep lines across his face. He hadn't slept much in days. Everything that had happened at Faith Hill Baptist still lingered like smoke. The cracked floorboards, the bone fragment under his fingertips, and the faint smell of old wood scorched by truth. At the defense table, Reverend Calhoun looked smaller than ever, a frail man wrapped in a gray suit. His hands rested over a Bible that had seen as much guilt as prayer. Lillian sat a few rows behind him, her eyes rimmed red, her posture rigid with silent loyalty. When the hearing began, the courtroom quieted to an almost sacred hush. Judge Davenport, a tall man with sharp features and an unwavering tone, addressed the court. "This hearing," he said, "is not about vengeance. It is about closure." The prosecuting attorney, a young woman named Dana Cole, stood and turned toward the gallery. For 63 years, a young woman's death was written off as a runaway. The truth was hidden beneath sermons and silence. Reverend Calhoun may have not struck the fatal blow, but he sealed the crime under the guise of holiness. He didn't deny it. When it was his turn to speak, Reverend Calhoun rose slowly, resting a shaking hand on his cane. "Everything she says is true," he said quietly. "I lied to the police. I protected a murderer. I believed that sparing the church would please God. I see now that no house built on buried truth can ever stand." The courtroom felt frozen. Even the judge seemed momentarily still, his gavel suspended in hand. Calhoun went on. "I thought I could preach my way toward redemption. 63 years of sermons, 63 years of pretending the blood on my hands had washed away with age. It never did. Every baptism, every blessing, her name was between me and heaven." Marcus studied him from his seat. As much as he wanted to hate the old man, something inside him softened. This wasn't a monster on trial. It was a man who had chosen cowardice over courage and spent a lifetime paying for it. When Dana Cole presented the evidence, photographs of the burial site, fragments of Evelyn's dress, the preserved church records, the room fell into quiet disbelief. So many documents, so many signatures, and yet one truth had remained buried because of fear. After a recess, the judge asked if Marcus wished to speak. He hesitated, then rose and walked toward the front. The courtroom cameras turned as he took the stand, hands clasped tightly together. "My father spent his whole life searching for his sister," he began. "He died not knowing she was just a few miles away under a church floor. I can't tell you what justice means after 63 years. But I can tell you this. Silence kills people faster than bullets. The Reverend didn't bury her body to be cruel. He did it because he was afraid, and fear ruins more lives than sin." He paused, glancing at Calhoun. The old man's eyes met his, heavy with tears. "I don't want you in prison," Marcus said finally. "You've already served a sentence no walls could contain. But I do want you to tell the truth, every last part of it, to the world that listened to your lies." Whispers spread through the courtroom. Even the judge seemed to take a breath before speaking. "Your words carry weight, Mr. Carter," he said, "more than the court can measure." By afternoon, the proceeding concluded. The judge ruled that due to Calhoun's age and deteriorating health, no prison sentence would be imposed. Instead, he was to perform a public statement to the community, an act of admission broadcast from the same church that had shielded his sin. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed, microphones waved. Marcus slipped past them silently, his thoughts a blur of exhaustion and purpose. Justice had come in a strange form, not punishment, but exposure. That evening, under a gray Atlanta sky, Reverend Calhoun stood once more at Faith Hill Baptist Church. The sanctuary was filled beyond capacity. The yellow tape was gone, replaced by cameras, news anchors, and members of the congregation who had returned out of shock or curiosity. He stepped to the pulpit one last time. "I once believed the church was God's greatest shelter," he began, his voice thin but steady. "But I forgot that truth is the foundation of faith. Without truth, the walls we build are empty." He turned toward the old wooden cross behind him. Evelyn Carter came to me for salvation, not to be buried under my fear. I failed her. I failed God. And I failed all of you. Many in the congregation wept openly. Some prayed aloud. Others simply listened, still trying to reconcile the man before them with the one they had trusted all their lives. We are all complicit, he continued. Every time we choose comfort over conscience. Every time we silence a voice to preserve an image. If my soul finds peace tonight, let it be because I finally spoke the words I should have said in 1962. He closed his Bible slowly and looked toward Marcus, who stood near the back. Their eyes met, 2 generations bound by the same woman's ghost. Reverend Calhoun placed one trembling hand over his heart and whispered into the microphone, Evelyn Carter, forgive me. When the service ended, the crowd filed out quietly into the cold evening. Marcus remained, standing near the altar where sunlight streamed through the reopened floorboards. The weight that had haunted this place felt lighter, replaced by something close to peace. Lillian approached, brushing away tears. He may not live much longer, she said softly. Marcus nodded. He doesn't have to. He finally told the truth. The church bells began to ring outside, slow and heavy. Each toll echoed across the city, a reminder of the years lost, the voices forgotten, the lies redeemed. For the first time, Faith Hill Baptist wasn't hiding a sin, it was bearing witness. And in that truth, Evelyn Carter, silent for 63 years, finally had her home. Autumn settled over Atlanta with its usual quiet grace, the air crisp and clean after weeks of turmoil. Faith Hill Baptist stood unchanged from the outside, red bricks glistening in the morning light, the steeple rising sharp against the pale sky. Yet everyone in the city knew it was no longer the same church. The crowds had gone. The cameras had left. What remained was something quieter, more powerful. Memory. Marcus returned to the site nearly every day. The police had completed their work, and the church foundation had been repaired, though a visible outline in the wooden floor still marked where Evelyn Carter had once lain. People now called it Evelyn's place. Some left flowers. Others knelt, whispering prayers for the sins of others as much as their own. Inside, the sanctuary felt strangely alive again. The heavy air that once clung to the pews had lifted, replaced by something raw and sacred. Marcus often found himself sitting alone in the back, listening to the silence, not an empty silence, but the kind that holds presence. On one of those mornings, a gentle knock echoed across the hall. Detective Ellen Braxton appeared, dressed in plain clothes instead of her usual trench coat. I heard you've been helping Mrs. Calhoun organize the records, she said. Marcus smiled faintly. Trying. Most of what they kept here is over half a century old. She wants to turn the fellowship hall into an archive for civil and church history. Something to remind people that truth isn't supposed to disappear. Ellen stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the room. The city council approved it yesterday, she said. They want it open by spring. Faith Hill will stand, but not as it was. It'll bear Evelyn Carter's name. Marcus's eyes widened. The city agreed to that. They did, Ellen replied. Community voted in favor. They think it's time Atlanta stops burying things that make it uncomfortable. For the first time in weeks, Marcus smiled. A genuine smile that reached his eyes. She'd like that, he said softly. Ellen nodded. She would. The two stood in reflective silence. Through the stained glass, sunlight filtered down into shifting hues of gold and red, bathing the sanctuary in warmth. The colors looked like forgiveness, imperfect but steady. Ellen finally spoke again. You should know, Reverend Calhoun passed away last night. Marcus went still. Where? At home, Ellen said. Lillian was with him. He asked her to leave his Bible open to Psalms 51 before he closed his eyes. She paused. It looked like peace. Marcus sat slowly in the nearest pew. He carried that guilt until his last breath, he murmured. I guess that was the only justice left for him. Ellen placed a soft hand on his shoulder. Sometimes confession is the sentence, she said. That afternoon, mourners gathered one final time at the church, though not for Evelyn. It was for the man who had buried her story and then spent his life trying to undo it. His coffin was simple pine wood, resting at the foot of the altar where he had preached for 6 decades. There were no cameras this time, no reporters, only the faces of those he had once led and failed. Lillian sat near the front, a small bouquet of lilies in her lap. She looked smaller but lighter, the years of secrecy finally shed. When the short service ended, she approached Marcus. "He asked me, in his final note, to give this to you," she said, handing him a folded letter. The paper was worn, the handwriting shaky, but legible. Marcus waited until he was alone to open it. The letter read, "Marcus, asterisk, if you're reading this, my voice is gone, but not my repentance. I could not undo what was buried, but you did. You gave Evelyn her name back, and you gave me one last chance at truth. Don't let her story die again. Make her more than a tragedy. Make her remembered, asterisk. Thomas Calhoun." The words blurred as tears filled Marcus's eyes. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his Bible. Then he turned once more toward the altar, that eternal stage of both faith and failure. Days turned into weeks. Workers began restoring the old building, sanding the wood, oiling the pews, repainting the walls. Marcus stayed involved, organizing Evelyn's archive, photos, letters, newspaper clippings, and newly recovered civil records detailing the segregation and struggles of early 1960s Atlanta. People began coming from all over the state to volunteer. By winter, Faith Hill reopened under a new name, the Evelyn Carter Memorial Chapel. The dedication ceremony was small but heartfelt. Lillian Calhoun sat in the front row, holding the same Bible her husband had once used. Marcus stood before the crowd and spoke, not as a victim's relative, but as a witness to what silence can cost. "When we bury the truth," he said, "we bury people." Evelyn's story isn't just about death. It's about what happens when we let fear become louder than compassion. She wasn't a ghost haunting us. She was a light waiting to be found. The congregation rose in applause. Some wept. Ellen stood in the back with folded arms, smiling faintly. After the ceremony, Marcus stepped outside. The air was clear, the sky painted with soft orange light. The world was quiet, not the heavy silence of guilt, but the gentle, free silence of closure. Across the street, a group of children ran past, laughing, chasing the sound of their own voices. Life had kept moving, as it always does, finally making room for honesty. He looked back at the church, once a monument to false peace, now a sanctuary for truth. The cracked floor had been sealed, but one small board remained untouched near the altar, marked by a brass plaque that read simply, "Evelyn M. Carter, 1945-1962. Her voice endures." Marcus touched the edge of the brass plate, whispering, "You're home now." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of church bells. They didn't sound mournful this time, they sounded new. The city of Atlanta had remembered, and at last, forgotten nothing. Spring arrived in Atlanta with a kind of beauty that feels deliberate, as if the city itself wanted to reclaim its soul. The dogwoods bloomed pale white along Magnolia Avenue, and the morning sun reflected on the polished windows of the newly christened Evelyn Carter Memorial Chapel. It had taken months of renovation, donations, and patience, but at last, Faith Hill Baptist Church had transformed into something new, not a temple built on secrecy, but a living record of truth. Marcus arrived early that morning to open the doors. He had begun working as the chapel's historical curator, carefully tending to the displays now housed in the former fellowship hall. Inside were photographs of 1960s Atlanta, newspaper clippings detailing the civil rights marches, and a section dedicated entirely to Evelyn Carter, a young woman whose courage outlived every lie told to bury her name. Students visited daily on field trips, guided through by volunteers who spoke about injustice, forgiveness, and the way to silence. Marcus never tired of watching them. The way they leaned in close to read Evelyn's letters, the awe on their faces when they realized she had been their age when she died. That morning, a small group of high schoolers entered the hall, led by a teacher who whispered reverently, "This is where they found her." The students fell quiet, a mixture of curiosity and sadness flickering in their eyes. Marcus greeted them by the display case holding Evelyn's rosary and the faded church registry that still bore her name. She wasn't famous, Marcus said softly, addressing the group. She didn't lead a movement, but she mattered because she refused to disappear, even when others tried to make her. One student raised her hand. What happened to the man who hurt her? Marcus nodded slowly. He's gone now. But more important than what happened to him is what she left behind. A reminder that truth always finds a way to rise, no matter how deep we bury it. The girl lowered her hand, her eyes moist. Marcus recognized that reaction. The quiet ache of realizing history isn't just in the past. It's inside the choices people make every day. After the tour, Marcus stepped outside. The city hummed around him, buses passing, children laughing. The world unaware of the stories still buried beneath their own streets. He found Ellen Braxton sitting on the steps, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "You've turned this place into something that matters," she said with a faint smile. "I didn't," Marcus replied. "She did. I just gave her back her name." Ellen looked out at the street. "Funny thing about names. They outlive us. They can't be silenced forever." Marcus nodded, watching the morning light bounce off the brass plaque near the entrance. "Do you ever think about what makes something unforgivable?" he asked. Ellen pondered the question for a long moment before answering. "The only unforgivable thing," she said, "is pretending there's nothing to forgive." Her words lingered in the air. Marcus thought about Reverend Calhoun, about the wreckage of guilt and grace that had defined his final months. Despite everything, the old man's confession had broken more chains than his silence ever could. They sat in companionable quiet until a car pulled up across the street. Lillian Calhoun stepped out, moving slowly but with purpose. She carried a small box wrapped in linen. When she reached them, she smiled gently at Marcus. "I thought you might want this for the exhibit," she said. Marcus accepted the box carefully. Inside lay Reverend Calhoun's old Bible, the same one he had clung to during his final days, its pages aged and fragile. A single note rested inside the front cover. "Let truth be the sermon that never ends." Marcus looked up, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he said quietly. Lillian nodded and placed a wrinkled hand over his. "He waited too long," she said, "but at least he waited long enough to tell it." Later that day, Marcus placed the Bible in the display beside Evelyn's belongings. Visitors paused longer there than at any other artifact. Two stories intertwined, one of innocence and faith betrayed, the other of guilt and redemption finally found. Together, they told Atlanta something more profound than any sermon ever could. As evening fell, the chapel's stained glass windows glowed gold against the setting sun. People lingered outside after closing, some praying, others simply staring in silence. What had once been a symbol of hypocrisy was now a monument to transformation.
For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.